That evening, Dorothy stood at her living room window, watching the police car pull up to her neighbor's house. Her hands were steady now. No more trembling, no more tears. Only the quiet certainty that justice, delayed for months, had finally arrived. Hello, dear friends. I'm Margaret Hayes, and this is a new story about revenge and justice. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional life stories. Dorothy Brennan had lived in the same house for 43 years. It was a modest two-story home on Maple Street, with cream-colored shutters and a front porch where she kept her late husband's rocking chair. Every morning, she would brew a pot of Earl Grey tea, the kind Robert had loved, and sit with the newspaper as sunlight filtered through the lace curtains her mother had sewn decades ago. The house smelled of memory, of cinnamon from the cookies she baked on Sundays, of lavender sachets tucked into drawers, of old wood and well-loved furniture. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed every hour, a comforting rhythm that marked her days. She had raised 2 children here, buried a husband, and built a life from routines that felt sacred. Dorothy wasn't wealthy, but she was rich in what mattered. Family heirlooms filled every room. Her grandmother's porcelain tea set displayed in the china cabinet, Robert's military medals in a shadow box above the mantel, her mother's hand-embroidered quilts folded carefully in the linen closet. Each object held a story, a voice, a piece of those she'd lost. Her children, both living out of state now, called every Sunday. But Dorothy couldn't imagine leaving. This house was her anchor, her museum of love. Then Gregory Holt moved in next door. He was a man in his mid-40s, loud and brash, with a taste for expensive cars and late-night parties. From the first week, he made his presence known, blaring music at midnight, parking his truck halfway across Dorothy's driveway, letting his untrained dog dig up her flower beds. Dorothy tried to be neighborly. She brought him cookies, introduced herself politely, gently mentioned the noise. Gregory barely looked at her. "Yeah, sure, whatever," he muttered, already turning back to his phone. The problems escalated. His guests blocked her mailbox. His trash blew into her yard. Once, his dog trampled her rose bushes, the ones Robert had planted the year before he died. When Dorothy knocked on his door to ask him to please keep the dog leashed, Gregory opened it with irritation. "Lady, it's just a dog." "Those roses were special to me," she said quietly. "My husband." "Look, I don't have time for this." The door slammed in her face. Dorothy stood there, stunned, her heart pounding. But she told herself, be patient. Be kind. People change. She was wrong. It started small, then became unbearable. Gregory began hosting parties every weekend, cars lining the street, music shaking her walls until 2 in the morning. Dorothy called the police twice, but by the time they arrived, the noise had quieted just enough to avoid a citation. One morning, she woke to find trash scattered across her lawn, beer bottles, food wrappers, cigarette butts. She spent an hour cleaning it up, her back aching, tears of frustration blurring her vision. She whispered to no one. But the worst came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Dorothy had gone to her weekly book club, as she did every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. She locked her doors, checked the windows, and left feeling safe in the quiet neighborhood she'd known for decades. When she returned 3 hours later, her front door was ajar. Her breath caught. She stepped inside slowly, her purse clutched to her chest. The living room was destroyed. Her grandmother's porcelain tea set, shattered on the floor, pieces scattered like snow. The shadow box with Robert's medals, ripped from the wall, glass cracked, the medals missing. The quilts her mother had sewn, torn, stained with beer, crumpled in the corner. Furniture was overturned, drawers hung open, their contents dumped. The grandfather clock had been knocked over, its face cracked, The pendulum bent. Dorothy sank to her knees among the wreckage, a sound escaping her throat, half sob, half scream. The police came. They took her statement, photographed the damage, dusted for prints. The officer asked. Dorothy's hands shook as she pointed next door. I think it was him." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll investigate." Days passed. The investigation stalled. Gregory, when questioned, claimed he'd been at work all day. His friends said the same. No fingerprints matched any database. The case went cold. Dorothy sat in her ruined living room, surrounded by the fragments of her life, and felt something inside her break. But then, slowly, it began to harden. For 2 weeks, Dorothy barely slept. She cleaned what she could, but some things were beyond repair. The porcelain couldn't be glued back together. The medals were gone, sold probably or thrown away. Her mother's quilts, stained and torn, were irreplaceable. Her daughter Claire flew in from Oregon. "Mom, you need to move." "I'm not leaving," Dorothy said quietly. Claire flew home worried, but Dorothy had already begun to plan. She wasn't a vengeful woman by nature. She'd lived her life by kindness, by faith in goodness. But something had shifted. The destruction of her home wasn't just theft. It was desecration. And Gregory's smug denial, his cold indifference, ignited something she hadn't felt in years. Resolve. Dorothy started small. She installed security cameras, discreet ones, positioned to capture her front door, yard, and driveway. She also angled one toward Gregory's property, just enough to see his comings and goings. Then she began to watch. She noted his schedule: late mornings, frequent visitors, packages delivered at odd hours. She noticed the same car arriving every few nights, a nervous young man who never stayed long. One evening, Dorothy saw Gregory hand the young man a small package in exchange for cash. Her heart raced. She saved the footage. Next, she did something clever. She researched local ordinances and discovered Gregory's home-based business violated several zoning laws. His frequent parties broke noise ordinances she could now document with timestamps. His unleashed dog violated county leash laws. She had footage of that too. But Dorothy wanted more than fines. She wanted justice. So she made a call to an old friend, Tom Whitaker, a retired detective who'd once helped her late husband with a legal matter. Over coffee, she explained everything. Tom watched her footage carefully. His expression darkened. "Dorothy, if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing, this man isn't just a bad neighbor." Dorothy nodded. Tom smiled. Within a week, Tom connected Dorothy with an active detective in the narcotics division. She provided her footage, her documentation, and her testimony. The detective was impressed. "Ma'am, this is excellent work. We've had our eye on this address, but we needed probable cause." Dorothy felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, she asked. 3 weeks later, Dorothy was baking bread when she heard the sirens. She stepped onto her porch, wiping flour from her hands, and watched as 3 police cars surrounded Gregory's house. Officers in tactical vests approached the door. One knocked, hard. "Police!" Gregory appeared, disheveled and furious. Dorothy watched as they entered. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering. She stood quietly, her hands folded, her expression calm. Within an hour, officers carried out boxes, evidence bags filled with substances, scales, cash. Gregory was led out in handcuffs, shouting protests that no one believed. One officer approached Dorothy. "Ma'am, we wanted to thank you." "I just wanted my street to be safe again," she said softly. But Dorothy wasn't finished. Over the next days, she filed formal complaints with the Homeowners Association, backed by months of documented violations. She contacted the landlord who owned Gregory's house, turns out he was renting, and provided evidence of property damage and illegal activity. The landlord was horrified. "I had no idea." Dorothy also reached out to the families whose children had been buying from Gregory. She didn't shame them. She simply provided information, gently, mother to mother. One by one, Gregory's world unraveled. His bail was high, his legal fees mounted. The landlord evicted him. His friends vanished. Within 2 months, the house next door sat empty, a for rent sign swaying in the wind. Dorothy stood on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the street gold, and felt the weight she'd carried finally lift. Justice, quiet and thorough, had been served. Gregory Holt never returned to Maple Street. He pled guilty to multiple charges and served 18 months. When he was released, he moved to another state, his record following him like a shadow. The people he'd hurt, the families, the neighbors, moved on. Dorothy's home slowly healed. She couldn't replace what was lost, but her children surprised her on her birthday with a restoration project. They scanned old photos of her mother's quilts and had replicas made. They framed Robert's commendations and photographs. The porcelain couldn't be replaced, but they filled the cabinet with new memories, her grandchildren's artwork, family photos, tokens of love. The new neighbors who moved in next door were a young couple with a baby. They introduced themselves shyly, bringing Dorothy homemade cookies. She invited them in for tea. "I hope we're not too loud," the young mother said, bouncing her infant gently. Dorothy smiled. Life on Maple Street returned to peace, the kind Dorothy had once taken for granted, but now treasured fiercely. Years later, Dorothy still lived in the house on Maple Street. She was older, slower, but her spirit had never been sharper. She'd learned something in those dark months after the break-in. That kindness isn't weakness, and that standing up for yourself isn't cruelty, it's dignity. Her grandchildren visited often now, filling the house with laughter. She taught them to bake, told them stories about their great-grandmother's quilts, showed them Robert's medals, the ones her daughter had managed to track down and repurchase from a pawn shop. Dorothy thought for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. But fear doesn't mean you do nothing." The child nodded solemnly, then ran off to play. Dorothy poured herself tea from a new porcelain set, not her grandmother's, but beautiful in its own right, and looked out the window at the quiet street. Because revenge, she'd learned, wasn't about hatred. It was about refusing to let cruelty win. It was about protecting what mattered. And sometimes, it bloomed not in fury, but in patience, evidence, and the quiet certainty that justice always finds its way home. Thank you for listening. Do you think she went too far? Or did she simply take back her justice? Share your thoughts in the comments.